Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Toronto Wildlife Exploration Workshop. We are so happy to have you and excited to get started. My name is Erlia Rasul, and I am the founder and executive director at Terra Elysium. I'm also accompanied by my team here. I will start by introducing our chat and event moderators. The first one is Tina Nguyen, who is our executive support specialist. Then there is Shaniko Maris, our communications and content manager, as well as Jennifer Lamb, our community outreach manager. For presenters today accompanying myself, we have Joelle Duff, who is our policy and contracts officer. We have Erica Alahar, who is our development and marketing manager. And we have Karina McDonald, our innovation and data manager. We are so excited to get started, and we're going to jump right into our housekeeping rules.
Yeah, so the first one is just please, nice to meet you as well, Justin. The first one is please just mute yourself if you aren't speaking, just to minimize background noise. This will be recorded as an educational resource, but as you all know, you do not need to turn on your camera if you are not comfortable. You can use the raise hand feature if you'd like to speak or contribute to any of the discussions that we will be chatting about today, or the chat, of course. And then please respect everybody's viewpoints and opinions and maintain respectful language and tone throughout the session, as well as if you encounter any technical difficulties, you can reach out to our moderators and respect the privacy of others, as well as do not share any personal information. I do want to make a special note that participants who stay till the very end of the workshop, particularly regarding the interactive activity, will receive community engagement certificates, and those will be sent out a week after the session. Next slide. So how our schedule looks for today, our introduction housekeeping, which we've already done, so we're ahead of schedule today. And then we have our educational session from 6:45 to 7:45. And then we have a short break for everybody to stretch your legs, grab a snack if you need, and then an interactive activity from 7:55 to 8:30. We may not end up using all the time for today. Our discussion and final remarks is scheduled for 8:30 to 8:50, but it'll just depend on how long the interactive piece takes, and of course, if any of you have questions throughout the session. Next slide. So our table of contents for today, what we'll be chatting about, our first section will be about wildlife specifically in Toronto. So this includes what animals actually reside in Toronto and a little bit about ecosystem dynamics to be able to understand the overall balance. Then we'll be chatting about humans and wildlife, particularly interactions between humans and wildlife. Then we'll be chatting about, for section 3, wildlife impacts. So historically, what has happened to wildlife? Has there been human impact? Has this resulted in decreased numbers of animals? And then section number 4 will be wildlife adaptation, so behavioral changes, particularly with animals as a result of urbanization and the expansion of cities. Next slide. Section number 5 will be about conservation, specifically policy, which is super important, and it's a huge part in what we're able to do in a city to protect wildlife. Then we'll be chatting a bit about the positive future and what conservation will look like if certain policies are implemented. And then we will be chatting about what you can do as everyday citizens who may or may not know about wildlife. And there's no prerequisite to know anything about wildlife for today. It is just if you are passionate about animals, why you'd want to save them, and supporting wildlife within Toronto. Next slide. So I think this is a great question to start. Our first question is, why should we care and learn about wildlife? So you can drop some answers in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves and give a potential answer.
Can I speak? I'm trying to find the raise hand button, but sorry if I'm interrupting.
No worries, no worries.
I think that animals, humans, and plants are very interconnected. So if we get rid of one of them, it's like a chain that will get disrupted. That's why I think we need wildlife and plants and, everything.
Very good answer. Very good answer. And that is very true. And we'll chat a bit about the different chains today. Justin said in the chat, wildlife plays a huge role in our ecosystem, which is also very true. So we'll move on to the next slide. So this is a quote that I think really speaks to this point very well. It's by Steve Irwin, who many of you may know. Steve Irwin was a wildlife enthusiast and he worked very closely with animals. And the quote is, "If we can teach people about wildlife, they will be touched. Share my wildlife with me because humans want to save things that they love." And that is the purpose of our session today. It is to share about wildlife, to educate you guys, but also so you guys can share and that other folks will be more inclined to save the wildlife that we all love. Next slide.
Oh my God, there's not a lot of
So now
people.
we'll head into our first section, which is wildlife in Toronto. So what animals live in Toronto? Next slide.
Oh, we have 8 people who showed up. Oh wait. I am so sorry.
Oh, no worries. So
I'm
for
really
this,
proud of the work you did. I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. I'm really excited for this workshop and I'm really sorry for my comment.
no worries. Thank you for coming, Christina. I'm very excited to chat with you today as well. So we have a photo here of a food chain, and it's really important to go through the basics of what food chains look like, as somebody had already said, and had already said that everything's interconnected, and that is very true. So a food chain is essentially, it represents the flow of energy and nutrients through an ecosystem. And so it's what we eat, how we interact with different species, primarily in the sense of diet. So producers, which are at the bottom of the food chain, these are organisms, mainly plants, that produce their own food through photosynthesis, converting sunlight into energy. Then we have the primary consumers, also known as herbivores. And these organisms feed directly on producers. They include animals such as rabbits, deer, and insects, anything that just primarily eats herbs and things that grow plants, trees. Secondary consumers, these are carnivores that feed on primary consumers. In this case, it is the bird, but the bird is also a herbivore as well. So it's kind of a mix of both. Secondary consumers can be both herbivores and carnivores. This also includes animals like snakes, birds of prey, and carnivorous insects. And then we have tertiary consumers, which these are predators that feed on secondary consumers. In this case, it is our lovely snake here. And snakes, in this case, this occupies the third level of the food chain and can include animals like large fish, some birds, and other predatory animals. So you often hear times the phrase apex predators, and apex predators sometimes, well, oftentimes they are also tertiary consumers, but in this case, we have specifically chosen an example that distinguishes it. In this case, it's the owl. And so they are at the top of the food chain and they have no natural predators. So they play a crucial role in maintaining the balance of their ecosystems by controlling populations of other animals. So apex predators can be tertiary. And you'll often see common examples of this, like lions, sharks, eagles. These are animals that dominate their environments. So as you can see, all of these levels are very interconnected. Next slide. So when we're talking about Toronto, of course, Toronto has its own very special blend of species. And so I'd like to bring attention to that. So in Toronto, our primary producers, which are also referred to as autotrophs, these are organisms who, as we said, convert sunlight into energy through photosynthesis. And in Toronto, these include sugar maple, eastern white pine, red oak, cottonwood, the common milkweed. These plants form the base of the food webs and they provide sustenance for primary consumers and pretty much the entire ecosystem, and of course, us as well. And so their diet consists of sunlight, water, nutrients from the soil. And so they're very essential, especially in regards to balancing organic matter, which within soils to be able to keep soils healthy. Our next group are herbivores. also known as primary consumers. And so these are the cute little guys. These are the ones that are squirrels, rabbits, chipmunks, even the Canadian geese. So these guys also play a crucial role in regulating plant populations and nutrient cycling as well. And I'm sure you guys have heard they also play a huge role in seed dispersal. Taking seeds from plants and tossing them around is actually super helpful. And their diets consist of vegetation, so leaves, grasses, seeds, fruits, anything you can get from plants and vegetation. So when we're moving on to the next section, this is the secondary consumers. So these guys, they can be consumers or they can be herbivores or omnivores or carnivores in that case. And so these guys basically are opportunists. They will eat whatever they can find. So these are raccoons, coyotes, even skunks, and then there's also the eastern coyotes as well in Toronto, which are different than the general subspecies of coyotes. And so these guys also contribute to controlling herbivore populations and maintaining the overall balance. Their diet consists of a variety of different things: plants, insects, small animals, and even the decaying flesh of animals who have already died. Tertiary consumers, which we have mentioned earlier. So these guys, in this case, a lot of them are apex predators. So they pretty much, when you say apex predators, the highest trophic level of an ecosystem. So we're talking about Cooper's hawk, peregrine falcon, the great horned owl, which is super beautiful, and then also red-tailed hawk and barred owl within Toronto. So these are extremely important, and of course they feed on other animals, smaller animals, insects, reptiles, pretty much anything. And then moving on, often this is forgotten, but our decomposers are also super important. They play a huge role in breaking down organic matter and recycling nutrients back into the ecosystem. In Toronto, we have a variety of decomposers, and these lists are not exhaustive. Of course, there are more species within Toronto that fall into each, but these are just examples of each one. These include the red wiggler worm, oyster mushroom, springtail, pillbug, or certain types of fungus. So they're super important when animals die. And then a last one that we often forget, but it's our own domesticated species. So cats, dogs, all these different species also influence the environments around them, and they interact with native wildlife and can have both positive and negative impacts on local ecosystems. Next slide. So this is a visual for what we just spoke about. And so as you can see, the apple tree would be food for the eastern gray squirrel. And then the eastern gray squirrel would be food for the raccoon. And then the raccoon would be attacked and eaten by a great horned owl. And then any of these animals, specifically, like any of them would, when they die, they'd be decomposed by different decomposers. For example, the red wiggler worms. So all in all, the key takeaway here is that maintaining a balance among trophic levels is super important and crucial for the health and stability of urban ecosystems, especially in the face of habitat loss and fragmentation. So each of these levels, one is not more important than the other. They all play a unique role in energy transfer, nutrient cycling, and population regulation. So it is super important to keep all of these functioning so that we're able to have these very interconnected and super important food webs. Next slide.
Hello. So now we're going to talk about humans and wildlife, and specifically, what do humans and wildlife, what do their interactions look like? So we can go to the next slide. So human and animal wildlife interactions, there's a variety of different ones that can occur in urban areas, such as in Toronto, and they often stem because of habitat loss. So as we expand urban areas, we lose natural habitats, and we also see an increase in wildlife in urban spaces. This isn't because there's more animals suddenly, it's just because we're now sharing more space than we were before. And this can lead to different encounters with wildlife, especially those that are negative or an emphasis on stereotypical behaviors. a lot of it's fear-based. So for example, coyotes are now a common urban animal, and it's assumed that they're often out to get people or pets. So there's been a lot of discussion in recent years around them due to this fear and around this interaction with them and pets. So though there are cases where they have approached people, and there occasionally will be bite incidents with people and pets, they're a naturally fearful animal, and noise will usually deter them. Sorry. However, it's not always the case. Some coyotes can become habituated, so that means they become accustomed and used to people. Young coyotes are especially prone to this as they're learning how to be a coyote while they're also learning how to live with people. So they often are the ones who end up getting into these encounters because they don't understand that they aren't supposed to. So prevention of coyote incidents are demonstrated by the city through wildlife feeding bans, feeding laws in place. There's different education programs they run, whether that's social media posts, physical signage. They often host workshops, and then in extreme cases, they will relocate certain problem animals. Another common animal interaction in cities is opossums. They're known for their ability to play possum, and they'll play dead when they're threatened. So they're often considered a pest. They are invasive, and they're scavengers. So they can eat essentially anything and survive in different conditions quite easily. So they do well in urban areas. They're also considered to be a little creepy looking, which might play into the fear factor. They have like a thin rat tail. Their face is kind of resembling a skull. It's white. And they have about 50 teeth. So they have a lot of teeth. They're an invasive species, as I said, and they have a bad reputation, often around false knowledge and rumors. So even though they are invasive, which isn't good in itself, they're Canada's only marsupial, and they are actually very beneficial to our environment. So because they scavenge for food, they eat lots of different waste and pest species, keeping a cleaner environment for us. And their main diet, a big portion of their diet, is ticks. And ticks are becoming there's not more ticks around, but there's more knowledge of ticks as due to climate change, we have longer, warmer seasons, longer tick seasons. Opossums eat about 4,000 ticks a week. One opossum can eat 4,000 ticks a week, which is 4,000 ticks less to impact us. Another primary misconception is that they carry diseases like rabies. However, this is false. Their body temperature is too high. They can't carry the virus, so that means they can't carry it, they can't pass it on. So these are just a couple of the more common human-wildlife interactions that might occur in Toronto, or that you might have heard about occurring in Toronto and other urban areas. So if we go to our next slide, we have a question for you guys on what are some examples of human-animal interactions that you've heard of or witnessed. You can unmute or you can put them in the chat, up to you. Pigeons? Yeah, pigeons are pretty cool. I like them. Skunks. Skunks are cool too. They're around quite a bit. Geese. Yeah. Raccoons in the garbage. Yeah, these are all very good ones. And I feel like they're all ones that people have like negative opinions of, primarily. Squirrels. Cars running over squirrels. Yeah. Sometimes they're not the smartest. Foxes. Foxes are pretty. Pets. Yeah. Different encounters with them. Yeah, so those are all some good examples, good answers. So we can move on to our next section, which is impacts on wildlife and especially what has happened to wildlife in Toronto through time. So On our next slide, we have some little information. So prior to European settlement in the 1700s, Toronto was a mixture of hardwood forest areas and low-lying wetlands, so swamps, marshes, primarily located there on the Don, Humber, and Rouge rivers. Sorry, sometimes I get that word mixed up. Anyways, a variety of animals existed that no longer are here, such as the passenger pigeon. And since that time, the city's been built up even more for urban development. Animals such as black bears, cougars, wolves are unable to sustain populations due to the shrinking forest habitats. And so they had to move out of this space. At least 10 fish species, 11 mammals, and 6 reptiles, which are amphibians and reptiles, no longer are found in the city. This doesn't mean they're extinct, it just means they can't survive in this area. So they've had to move out of it. Urbanization is the reason for this. So urbanization heavily alters and can erase habitats for wildlife because it creates challenges with increased pollution levels. So increased water pollution, air pollution, light pollution, noise pollution. And then the soil morphology of these areas also changes with increased hard spaces like pavements and such. And that also plays a big impact on the plants and animals. Extinction rates have been observed to be highest because of urban development, and it also has greater long-term effects compared to other forms of habitat loss. Extinction rates also can increase through urbanization and because of household pets. So you think about your cats that you let out, and often they might bring you back a bird. I know certain areas have had a lot of issues with songbird populations declining because of domestic cats. Vehicles on roads also heavily contribute, as someone in the comment mentioned, squirrels getting hit by cars. In Ontario, there's about 14,000 wildlife collisions a year, and that's just large animals. It doesn't include things like squirrels, skunks, raccoons. Even though there's more of those hit per year, there's limited data available. People aren't tracking that as much. And these changing species in these urban areas leads to a shift in food webs, as we were discussing food webs before. Food webs are what make up ecological communities based on species interaction. So urbanization and the shift of species often involves the loss of higher trophic or larger predator species, which heavily changes the food web structure. Larger predators, think your apex predators we discussed before, they're more sensitive to fragmentation. So fragmentation is the breaking up of habitats due to either biological or human activities, such as volcanic eruptions, floods, clear cutting spaces, the development of roads, rail systems, housing, anything that will cause larger habitats to separate or into pieces or fragments, hence the name fragmentation. So then the habitat is even smaller because they can't get to areas they used to get to. And this can cause food webs to collapse due to the loss of species. So if a species has limited links in a food web, it's even more prone to disappearing from the area. So say if there was a specific animal that only ate certain insects and those insects couldn't survive, that animal's going to have to move to find where those insects can survive, or else it will also die. So species in an area can be either gradual or substantial changes. Gradual changes mean that multiple generations might not realize that the species they live with are different than those in the past and future. So the species we have right now differ from what they used to be, and they will probably look very different in the future as well. And then substantial changes, that just means that in one generation's lifetime, there will be a clear difference in a change in animal residence. So in my lifetime, say right now, there's a lot of squirrels in my area. Maybe there won't be as many squirrels in the future, or maybe there wasn't before. So either of these changes can occur at differing rates, depending on the situation. So if we look at our next slide, we have a couple maps. So on the left, we have a satellite image of Toronto in 1947. and then the right is in 2022. So as you can see there in the top left of the map, of the 1947 map, there's a lot of farmland that in the 2022 map is gone. So comparing these images is cool because you can see how there's fewer green spaces, and you can see how urban sprawl has heavily impacted the area. And you can kind of see different spaces that fragmentation might have occurred and why a lot of the animals had to move out. So we can move to the next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Corinna. So now I'm going to talk about wildlife adaptation and what wildlife have done in Toronto. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what is adaptation? So adaptation is any physical or behavioral characteristics of an organism that help it to survive in its environment. And in Toronto's ever-changing landscape, animals tend to either leave the city in search of more natural environments, or they make behavioral adaptations into city life. So behavioral adaptation is something an animal does, usually in response to some external stimulus in order to survive. So our city is not typically built with animals in mind, yet resilient species can change their behavior to live in our urban landscape. And a lot of the time, they live among us by depending on microhabitats. So a microhabitat is a small area which differs somehow from the surrounding habitat, and its unique conditions may be home to unique species that may not be found in the larger region. So a small example of a microhabitat is a bird feeder, because it can act as an attractant to both predators who are waiting for the prey who want to feed in like the bird seeds. And another example of microhabitat is Toronto's extensive ravine system. So there was actually a study conducted by U of T researchers where they wanted to capture the nightlife of animals in the ravine of Toronto. So in these two pictures, you could see how there is just some large mammals that aren't typically seen, but because they're mainly nocturnal and live exclusively in these microhabitats. But there is a lot of mammals in the ravines, from like small chipmunks to like large deer. And another way animals have adapted into city life is how they integrate their homes alongside human settlements. So in urban areas, these creatures have a big challenge in finding a suitable place that they can call home. And sometimes they secure a shelter in human homes. More often, you'll find these animals sheltering in hollow and warm spaces in the pockets of your home, like chimneys or attics or inside walls too. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now I'm just going to talk about just a few individual animals to see how they have adapted over time. So raccoons are indigenous to North American wooded areas and now to North American cities. And they're regarded as bright, intelligent animals, and they are known to cause disturbances to homeowners, specifically this time of year because this is when they give birth to their young ones. And they mostly do it in attics or sheds in urban homes. And fireplaces are one of the more potential entry ways for that raccoons can go into your home. And they also search for meals by going through your garbage or going through your garden because they have very nimble paws that make it easy for them to access the food containers in the garbage. And while raccoons and other wild animals will forage for natural food sources, if they find an easy food supply that is available to them, they'll definitely take advantage of it. So that's why they go through trash cans, recycling bins, and organic food waste bins. But much of these food that people unintentionally give them, it doesn't meet their dietary needs. When wild animals fill up on human junk food like bread and crackers and chips, they're missing out on important nutrients that would be found in natural food sources. In addition to health implications, wild animals that break into food and like garbage bins can also create conflict with humans because a lot of people see them as pests. Um, And also when they go into food containers, they could get trapped in the garbage bins. Like I see a lot of videos where like raccoons get stuck into those huge dumpster containers and it becomes like a large issue. And so to keep wildlife safe and healthy, it's important that you like wash out your food containers and just screw the lids back on tightly so that um, the raccoons can't really get to it. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now I'm going to talk about the Canadian geese. So Canadian geese are good at choosing nesting sites, even if it's hard for us to understand why. So they typically like open and flat spaces so they can see predators coming from far away. So usually on the left picture, you can see how in a natural setting, they would be close by water, like a pond, and it would be a flat open field. But because of urbanization, it's becoming increasingly more likely that they'll be nesting on top of roofs of apartments and condominiums. And they have to be able to be near water when their babies hatch. So this makes it difficult because they're trapped by like the barrier of the roof or like the roof is way too high. So it's important to check the roof regularly, like if it's like a school or something. Otherwise, they would have to be rescued by like a wildlife rescue team.
Thank you, Erica. So I'm going to speak a little bit about conservation strategies. So, what is environmental conservation? Conservation essentially just involves the protection, preservation, and management of natural environments and the communities that inhabit them. So this could include a variety of policies, such as resource management, which is just implementing sustainable practices and just managing natural resources like water, soil, and forest to prevent the degradation. Um, it could also include wildlife protection, which is just protecting species from extinction and maintaining biodiversity. It could look like pollution reduction, which is just reducing pollution through cleaner production methods such as waste management and emissions control, as well as education and awareness, which is essentially just educating the public about the importance of environmental conservation and encouraging practices that contribute to a sustainable future. So conservation falls under a few jurisdictions, such as federal, provincial, and municipal. So the federal government is in charge of CEPA, which is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and that's in charge of fisheries,
Can we flip to
navigation.
the, sorry, can we flip to the next slide? Yeah, thank you.
So as well as species at risk. And the provincial government is rules over the Ontario Environmental Protection Act, which oversees natural resources, mining, land use, and air and water quality. And the city or municipal government is in charge of various bylaws that deal with water supply, sewage treatment, waste collection, and land use. As well as Toronto does have a bunch of bylaws and municipal codes that address various aspects of environmental protection, such as the management of water and sewers, property standards, and the green roof bylaw, which just requires new buildings to include a portion of their roof as a green roof, which helps in managing stormwater, reducing urban heat islands, and improving the air quality, as well as providing a space for pollinators, and as well as the Toronto Waste Diversion Bylaw, which just enforces the separation of recyclables and organics from regular waste to increase the recycling waste rates and reduce the amount of waste sent to landfills. Next slide, please. Okay, so conservation in Toronto So most conservation efforts in Toronto are managed by the TRCA, which stands for the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. And just a little facts about the TRCA. They own over 40,000 acres of land in Ontario. They administer flood control, recreation, education, and watershed preservation activities. And it's actually a world leader in habitat restoration. So just a few programs that they currently have ongoing are the Nest Box program, which just creates habitats for songbirds, owls, ducks, pollinators, and mammals. They have meadow, forest, shoreline, and wetland restoration as well, which just increase wildlife habitats. They improve biodiversity and they support pollinators. Um, they also have the stream restoration project, which just improves fish movement and fish spawning grounds. So within the city of Toronto, there are numerous conservation initiatives that are ongoing, such as the Green Roof Bylaw, which is under urban greening. And just a little bit of fun facts about that. Toronto was actually the first city in North America to adopt such a bylaw when they created it in 2009. Um, Toronto also has the Urban Forestry Program, which just aims to protect, maintain, and enhance forests in Toronto. And this initiative just involves tree planting and maintenance, as well as community stewardship programs and the development of policies to protect trees and construction activities. There's also the Parks Plan, which just guides the long-term management of park development and enhancement, and it just aims to increase accessibility and increase naturalized spaces within parks and across Toronto to improve ecological health. Just a few more programs that Toronto has. We have the Toronto Wildlife Center. They have installed pollinator gardens across the city to support biodiversity. And we have the Portland Flood Protection Project, which is just a major project transforming the Portland into a mixed-use community that will also include a bunch of parks and green spaces that will provide habitats for various plants and wildlife. Next slide, please. Okay, so current policies. So a harmonious balance requires enhancing urban biodiversity while minimizing human wildlife conflicts. So essentially what this looks like is policies that will impact habitats in a positive way. So this could look like expanding protected areas to increase the amount of protected areas within and around urban settings. It could look like implementing ecological networks, which is just a network of green spaces that allows species to move and interact without coming into conflict with urban developments. This could also look like regulating development more by just having stricter regulations on urban development to ensure that there's a minimal impact on natural habitats. And this could also look like increasing community engagement, which would look like having more digital platforms for engagement, um, expanding environmental education in schools, and establishing a new idea that I like to call neighborhood conservation ambassadors, which is essentially a proposed program where we would train community members to serve as conservation ambassadors, and they would lead local environmental projects, and they would kind of act as a point of contact for city conservation efforts. So not only do we need policies that positively impact habitats, we also need to change policies that harm it. So currently, the big two main ones would be road and highway expansion and industrial activities. So road and highway expansion, those policies would those potential policies would look like reducing expansions and increasing investments in public transit to decrease the need for larger road networks and highways. And for industrial activities, that would look like regulating industrial activities near sensitive habitats, just so we can minimize the ecological disruption. And these measures, if implemented effectively, would lead to a more sustainable coexistence. Okay. Next slide, please. So just a question here. Um, in hindsight, do you think there were policies or measures that could have been implemented to prevent the transition of certain domesticated animals into wildlife in Toronto? So feel free to post your answer in the chat or unmute your mic. There it is. Yep. So I see in the chat, we should have implemented no feeding pigeons sooner. Um, yep. So pigeons actually do. There has been a recent increase or explosion in population of pigeons in Toronto that I think the city is actually trying to combat now, because pigeons actually are another food source for animals like coyotes and foxes, which increases their presence as well. Okay, I also see another comment here. Yeah, wildlife was not, sorry. It doesn't seem like wildlife was considered with the rapid urban sprawl, and I completely agree with that. We definitely have made policies in the past without thinking of the future consequences. We definitely need to start making policy that is more future oriented and takes into account the impact on wildlife. People that leave cats outside that aren't fixed is also a major issue. There also is a explosion of wild cats in the city, which also is another food source for coyotes, which also makes their population bigger as well. And then the last one I see here is that measures mostly stay on paper and are not executed that much. And I definitely agree with that as well. A lot of policy is proposed but never put into place. And I do think that is something that needs to change as well. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. So future outlook. So I will actually be doing this in combination with one of my colleagues, Erica. So I'll be doing the first couple of slides and then she'll take over for the last one. So what does wildlife sustainability mean for the future of Toronto? Next slide. So Toronto does have a positive outlook looking into the future. And there's a few key areas that specifically look positive for Toronto. So the first one is youth engagement. Youth in the city have never been more engaged in environmental initiatives. A lot of youth now are starting to take notice of climate change and its effect, and they're starting to take a stand. Toronto has been really proactive in involving youth in environmental and conservation efforts. And there's a lot of programs that engage young people in nature-related activities, such as tree planting, cleanup drives in the parks and along waterways, and wildlife monitoring projects. So these help foster a sense of stewardship for the environment. And this engagement not only educates the younger generation about the importance of conservation, but it encourages them to take active roles. Another good policy that Toronto is doing pretty well is just prioritizing transit expansion over road and highway expansion. Um, Toronto has a bunch of transit projects going on right now, such as the Finch and Eglinton LRT, as well as the GO RER project, which is one of the largest, which is the largest transportation project in North America. And what all of this essentially means is that it it kind of decreases the possibility of sprawl because it encourages density, which means that we're not consistently and we're not continuously expanding the city and tearing over wildlife habitats such as for an example, like in the green belt, or we're not touching our ravines to expand roads and highways. Toronto is doing really good in the field of expanding transit instead of expanding roads and highways. Toronto is also doing really well in green roofs. Their green roof bylaw is a significant step towards biodiversity. They provide additional habitats for various species, particularly for birds and pollinators and bees and butterflies. And they also reduce building energy consumption, and they manage stormwater. And another key positive aspect that Toronto's doing really well really well too is the ravine preservation. So Toronto has an extensive ravine system, as you probably have already known, and it's a vital part of the city's ecological framework. And it acts as a sanctuary for a lot of wildlife while also being inside a major city. Preserving these areas helps maintain the biodiversity by protecting a lot of natural habitats of various species. And ravines also play a crucial, they serve as a crucial corridor that allow for wildlife to move safely across the cities. So Toronto is actually doing a very good job in preserving them and not like decreasing them for more urban expansion. Okay, next slide. So a great example of a city that Toronto could potentially be like or should aspire to be is Singapore. So Singapore is often described as a city in a garden because it's a prime example of how a big city can harmoniously live um, and how a densely populated city can harmoniously integrate with green spaces. So just a couple of facts about Singapore. Um, it's located in Southeast Asia, and it consists of one main island and 62 smaller ones. It has a population of 5.7 million, and the total area is about 721 square kilometers. So in terms of biodiversity and wildlife, it's home to more than 400 species of marine wildlife and 2,100 plant species. It also has a lot of active biodiversity conservation initiatives. In terms of the development policies, they currently have a plan called the Green Plan 2030, which is a nationwide project that aims to reduce carbon emissions and increase energy and water efficiency, and also increase biodiversity. They also have a park connector network, which is an island-wide network that connects parks and other natural areas um, to make green spaces more accessible to the public and to promote eco-friendly transport options. In terms of their wildlife initiatives, they have three major ones that stand out, which is WRS, or Wildlife Reserve Singapore, which is an organization that manages the country's zoological institutions, such as the Singapore Zoo, the Night Safari, and River Safari. These play a huge role in wildlife conservation in Singapore because of their breeding programs, their education and their education about biodiversity. Nature ways, which are roots planted with specific trees and shrubs that facilitate the movement of birds and butterflies across certain urban areas, as well as the CBI, which is the Biodiversity Index, which is also known as the Singapore Index. And this helps cities evaluate and monitor the progress of their biodiversity conservation efforts against other cities worldwide. Next slide. So if all of the conservation policies mentioned were successful, then this could result in a significant enhancement for Toronto's natural environment and wildlife population. So I would say that a comprehensive approach is needed, which would include wildlife protection, pollution reduction, and energy conservation. And I would say that a great asset that Toronto has is the TRCA, and I would um, propose increased funding for their organization by the federal, municipal, and provincial governments, because their projects such as the shoreline restoration and wetland restoration and various others are not only crucial for wildlife, but they also benefit the community by improving the quality of life and reducing environmental risks like flooding. Next slide.
Yeah, so thank you for that. With that being said, it's important to learn how different animals interact with their environment so that we can understand how we can peacefully coexist in our shared habitats. It's important to be compassionate and keep a respectful distance from wild animals. And if they are infiltrating your property or looting your garbage, it's important to practice safe repellent techniques without harming these animals because they aren't really just pests. We're all just trying to live in the conditions that we created. So there's one example that I saw online about how to deter raccoons from your yard is to use like apple cider vinegar and like spray that down in areas like maybe your garbage or something in order to repel them because of its strong smell. So like little things like these can help you live alongside these animals without them being considered pests.
Yeah, now we'll move on into section number 7, which is our final educational session. This is what can all of you do at home and how do we as everyday citizens support wildlife in Toronto? Next slide, please. So there are a few different ways, and we have a self-reflecting owl on the side there. Um, so the first one would be volunteering with wildlife rehabilitation centers. So offering your time, your skills to organizations like the Toronto Wildlife Center by volunteering in various capacities. They have animal care departments, administrative supportive departments, as well as fundraising. Um, there's also participating in citizen science projects, and citizen science projects are essentially where citizens monitor wildlife and they're able to submit their findings into online platforms or mobile apps. And Toronto Wildlife Watch has a citizen science project like that. And then another option would be creating wildlife friendly gardens. So transforming your backyard or your balcony into a wildlife friendly habitat by planting native species, providing food and water sources, and creating shelter with features like birdhouses, bat boxes, and insect hotels. But of course, exercising caution is important with this as well. I think in general, in terms of creating wildlife friendly gardens, the main thing is really planting native species. But some folks are more comfortable and they have bigger spaces or they are able to, have birdhouses and different insect spaces. But generally, we do recommend caution when it comes to wild animals. Another option would be supporting local conservation groups, so getting involved with organizations such as Friends of the Rouge Watershed or Toronto Field Naturalists by participating in volunteer events, workshops, and advocacy campaigns, which all of you have already done a wonderful job at because you're in a workshop right now about wildlife, so that is a super big thing. Reducing, reusing, and recycling. This is also very important because that is how we can protect our different environments, and really minimizing single-use plastics that will really reduce pollution in Toronto's ecosystems, the ravines, the different really important parks. Promoting wildlife-friendly policies, so advocating for wildlife-friendly urban planning policies, green infrastructure initiatives, as Joelle had brilliantly shared a bunch of different initiatives that are happening in other cities that potentially we could emulate. So at the municipal level to protect and enhance wildlife habitats and parks, green spaces in urban areas. And really, I think the big thing is educating yourself and others. So learning about local wildlife species, their habitats, and the different challenges that conservation faces in Toronto. And there's educational resources, workshops like this one, guided nature walks to connect with nature, which is also extremely important. So really sharing your knowledge with friends, family, and community members to raise more awareness. Um, there's also participating in habitat restoration projects, so volunteering with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, TRCA, which Joelle had mentioned as well. And they do a lot of habitat restoration projects. They do a lot of tree planting, invasive species removal, and shoreline cleanups. We actually had beach cleanups as well. So that is something that we have done and will implement again in the summer. And this is essentially to improve the different habitats in natural areas, whether it be beaches or around parks. Um, and as we've already touched on, is practicing responsible pet ownership. Now that is very important. So as mentioned, getting your pet neutered or spayed, making sure that they're up to date on vaccinations, and then, minimizing their impact on local wildlife populations of native species. Some people let their dogs or their cats roam around freely, and that can really impact the native species that are in that area. And so oftentimes you'll see signs at beaches that say, dogs not allowed or dogs need to be on leash. And that's because we don't want to disturb the natural native species in that area. And then lastly, reporting wildlife emergencies. So if you encounter a sick, injured, or orphaned wildlife, contacting the Toronto Wildlife Center hotline or local animal control services for assistance. We do want to emphasize, please avoid handling wildlife yourself and follow the guidance of trained professionals. And essentially, by engaging in these everyday activities, you're able to play a significant role in protecting and also conserving Toronto's diverse wildlife populations and their habitats for future generations to enjoy. And we will be sending out a resource sheet with all of these programs, with all of these different methods on there so that you have that and they'll be sent out with your certificates. And that is so all of you can refer back to it when you want to know how you can, be a responsible pet owner or who to call in a wildlife emergency. So we will be sending that out. So now we're actually going to be on our break. So we finished right at time. So feel free to take about a 10-minute break and then we will come back to do our interactive activity. We can leave it at this slide for now. And then when you're back, we'll do interactive activity. And it's going to be super easy, super simple. So I know some people are shy, but it's really just going to be discussing some scenarios and discussing a bit about what we've already discussed. There will be guided questions, and we will be in the breakout rooms with you to be able to support if you're stuck or even just to answer some of your questions. If you have questions, that's also something that we can address in the interactive activity. So feel free to take your break now. We will be back in 10 minutes. So it is 7:45 now. We'll wait for other folks to trickle in again. But then we'll head into our interactive activity. I'll just give it an extra minute or so. Yeah, so welcome back from the break, everyone. glad to see you guys back. So we're gonna head into our interactive activity now. We'll head into the next slide, and these are the instructions, so I will read them out. So essentially, all of you will be assigned to breakout rooms corresponding to your group number will be the breakout room for this scenario. So a Jamboard link will be sent in the chat, and basically each sheet of the Jamboard is going to have a scenario on it. They're really easy, and you don't have to answer like all the guiding questions. It's just more of to guide the way that you're thinking in terms of what we learned today. And so this relates to conservation strategies, policies, and also just wildlife in general. So it's about 30 minutes of breakout room discussions, but I might pull people in a little bit before that. And then we'll reconvene and we'll just have a brief group discussion. And again, you don't need to unmute yourself to talk to your group in the breakout rooms. You can just send some things in the chat if that's what you're more comfortable with. And then we'll all go through the Jamboard together and we'll see all the different sticky notes. So you'll be pasting, there's a sticky note feature and you can just directly paste in your thought and then we can read them all out. So the Jamboard link has been sent. Thank you, Shaniqua. And so, yeah, all these ideas will facilitate discussion. So this is the part for the engagement certificates, but do remember that there are no wrong answers. If you stumble upon a question, we will also answer that together and it's a great opportunity to learn. So if you have not done so already, you can just click on the Jamboard link and I will send everybody off into breakout rooms. I just called everybody back. Did I do that too quick? Shan?
I think
No, you're great. You're great. Just feeling Martha because she just got here.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Let's wait for everybody to trickle back in and then we can get started on chatting about our answers. Okay, awesome. Why don't we screen share the Jamboard so we could see all the wonderful answers everybody put. Thanks again for sticking around, folks. And yeah, I'm excited to go through these. Okay, here we are. Oh, we have a sticky note on the first page. Is that meant to be for somebody's have more open chambers and have instant? That's cool. I think that was probably meant to be on there. That's awesome. So it looks like we have a lot of cool ideas. Okay, so we can go to the first scenario. So we can do this in multiple different ways. If the folks who did the scenario would like to share it themselves, that's also an option. Otherwise, I can read what's on there. But group number one, who did scenario number one, did you guys want to share a little bit about what you were thinking? Maybe some of the ideas that came up. You can even just read them. You don't have to explain like in super big detail. And if you learned anything, that would be great to share as well.
Hi, it's Arwa here. Well, mine signals are in yellow, so I'll just go over those. So the first one, I said incorporate green space in urban development plans. So for this, I was just thinking, whenever any of these, or let's say it's the city that's trying to do some sort of expansion where they're developing anything related to buildings, they could somehow incorporate greenery into it. So I think it's mentioned here in a different sticky notes, like having green roofs, things like that. I think that would be something that we could do. And then for the other sticky note, said build around hotspots of where animals tend to roam. So for this one, it's kind of, I think, self-explanatory, but if there's any areas that have high populations of animals, maybe try building in areas where it's lower just to avoid disturbing them. Um, what else did I say? So I also said build upwards instead of across. So if it's possible, having more higher skyscrapers instead of building into natural green space so that we can disturb the animals less instead just build on areas that are already developed. And that's kind of similar with the next one, which is redevelop on old developments that may not be in use. So there are kind of areas where the developments are old and have deteriorated, um, and maybe not in use as much, or maybe not much is coming from there. So I know a lot of businesses will buy out these old lands and just redevelop on there. So that's also another option. And maintain a clean space so the animals. Oh no, wait, that was not mine. The other one is a policy that prevents humans from harming the animals that may be present. So, like I know, for example, with geese, how we have fines if you accidentally kill them. Um, and also, we can make it mandatory to have park signages that describe the animals in the area and why they matter, just so that we are more mindful of them and feel towards animals and not want to cause any harm. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing. Those are really awesome ideas. I love what you guys color coded it too, based off of like whose is whose, and I think that that's super cool. But yeah, definitely. I like a lot of the ideas here, the different urban development plans, healthy lifestyles. I'm just reading some of them here. Transit expansion over road expansion, green roofs, rooftop gardens. These are all wonderful ideas. Building upwards instead of across. Yes, that's a big thing that's happening. And we're building into really key areas, or people are trying to build into key areas, like the green belt, for example, which is not great. Um, Even light pollution is a very awesome one that you guys brought up. And I think that's also super important. Clean space, wildlife friendly gardening. Yeah, definitely. Posting flyers around for urban development. Yeah, education is a huge thing. And I think anything that really is able to share this with folks will be able to um increase the results of these things not only being mentioned, but also being implemented. So wonderful job, group number one. Let's move to group number two now. So this is a really cool one, dispelling myths and preventing zoonotic diseases. So this is related to a lot of what we were chatting about with, myths around animals having diseases, the interactions, and um, yeah, this is super fun. So does group number two, anybody from group number two want to share a bit like some of the notes? You can just read them, or um, if you don't as well, I can also read some of them on there, but I would like to ask first if anybody wants to share.
We can share, and my teammates Karina and Eric, if you folks want to jump in at any point, please do. But here we didn't really color code too much, but we tried to color code a little bit based on the questions. Essentially, some of the big topics we talked about is so how can we better educate people about these myths? So we had a bunch of different like thoughts on how to educate. We can either integrate it into curriculum so that like children can learn it in schools when they learn about wildlife. I remember doing like food webs in class and things like that, so it could be integrated there, or also in parks as signage, so people who actually do visit parks and have more interaction potential for wildlife. We could have signage there about these certain diseases to educate. And also for the public, so public signage, for example, on the bus stops or in ad spaces, we can create more education that way. Also, in terms of education, we can involve different groups, so educational campaigns, whether it be like the TRCA or WWF or like local animal shelters, veterinarians. So we're talking about like how different audiences can educate different audiences. So for example, um, for vets, they can put more emphasis on zoonotic diseases that are relevant for pet owners when they talk to all these pet owners. Because I've worked at a vet clinic before, and while there is some education, it's not always like readily given. It's usually when people ask about it, but if they don't ask, then maybe they won't know. So that's something else. And then in terms of community engagement, we talked about how like universities and different like educational institutions can play a role, because a lot of them have like green spaces or wildlife or like spaces where there are lots of wildlife, for example, like arboretums or things like that. And then we talked about how we can integrate like wildlife related activities to the public. So, for example, things that we already do, like Pokemon Go, how we can potentially use something like that to encourage people to learn more or get outdoors, but in a responsible manner. And then how we can harness like social media. But there are challenges with that, because unless something goes very viral, it won't reach too many people who are not already in that space. And then we talked about different policies. So policies a little bit like we had some challenges because we were thinking about like, for example, fines that we can have in parks for like not responsibly interacting with wildlife, but then there's lots of pros and cons with that about like, okay, how is that going to be enforced or what's a good amount to set and things like that. But we could also have policies, for example, parks need to have a certain like number of signage or signage per every like however many square meters about these diseases or something like that. And then I don't want to like take too much time. Another one of the things that we talked about is how we can connect to people about these diseases. So for example, cat owners and like outdoor cats and the implications for wildlife. That could be a touchy subject for cat owners who don't want to not let their cat outdoors. But we were thinking like if we connect with them through the lens of like, zoonotic diseases, your cats could get diseases and then maybe either them be sick or you can get sick. That could be a good point of connection, just to so that they feel more connected about that versus like my cat is killing birds. They might not really like quote unquote care about that, versus getting sick. So those are just some things. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. This is really detailed, and I really love that you guys have said that a lot of this is education based, like the signage and the Pokemon Go, that was a really cool one. I was like, wow, that's really clever. Integrating those activities into everyday activities that people do. And then yeah, rabies, educating on the symptoms of rabies. I don't think people know a lot of symptoms of rabies. So when people develop rabies, they also become like hydrophobic, which is a big thing. That's what you see. Normally, um, hydrophobic is when you're scared of water, but in the sense that your whole body just sort of rejects it. And what rabies, like basically once you start showing symptoms, it's about a 99% chance that you'll die. Thankfully in Ontario, there's like not very many cases and most of them have to do with bats. And that's because the bait that they use to give like other animals and different vaccinations and whatnot to decrease the species to basically decrease the prevalence of it spreading is not something that they've been able to implement with bats very well. And bats are very diverse species. That's something that's you should look into, but they're very cool. And I really like that you've stated that partnering with universities, research institutions, and even how diseases transmit. You know, because a lot of people don't know, like, is it touching? Is it just a scratch, saliva? Like, how do these diseases go about? And I think that would really help with debunking a lot of myths, but also providing a lot of ways to educate the public on how to decrease diseases, but also how to respect animals because a lot of animals, people may not like animals because they think they're, dirty and whatnot, but really they're just trying to survive in the environments that like us, right? So yeah, wonderful, wonderful job, group number two. We will go to group number three now. So this one is habitat restoration and connectivity. So anybody from group number three want to share a bit about, these are very detailed, want to share a bit about what you thought in regards to this question?
Yep, so I could talk on behalf of the group. So one of the things that we did discuss was that education is the key priority. For example, just basically engaging youth through community events, wildlife workshops like this one, and that provides education around wildlife and conservation, and it just creates future leaders in stewardship. And things like having a program where high school students could gain habitat restoration projects and just volunteer for hours as well. And things like planting native species to promote habitat restoration and native pollinators. And another thing that we could do is to advocate for policy change at the municipal level to promote environmental protection and conservation of local green spaces like the green belt in Ontario, in Canada. And what else? We have joint green team initiatives and programs at your workplace or community to get involved in more sustainable practices in urban areas, and established green corridors that link existing green spaces, parks, natural reserves to allow wildlife movement across urban landscapes. Another thing is identify and prioritize areas of high biodiversity within the city that are risk of urban development, and just prioritize restoration efforts in areas within high biodiversity values such as ravines, waterfronts, and parks. And anything else I can see here. Yeah, and just basically advocate for government funding and policies that support habitat restorations. And that includes grants for community-led projects and organizations. And lastly, just creating a framework that includes the areas of most concern and potential steps to move forward, as well as information on how to stop more damage from occurring. Yeah, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
Wonderful job, group number three. Yeah, these are lovely. These are detailed. I like that you touched on the funding and the policy aspects. And I really like that you put an emphasis on ravines, waterfronts, and parks. I feel like Toronto's waterfront is really neglected. And that's something that people just assume. I mean, even with, I don't want to go into that today, but Lake Ontario being the last lake in the chain, the Great Lakes chains, a lot of the pollution is coming down from all the other lakes. And so, it's our basically we don't have any room to basically pollute it any further because the pollution's already traveling through it to get to the St. Lawrence Seaway. So, and then connecting back into the ocean. So I think this is lovely that you've mentioned pollinators and education and really connecting with different people to be able to promote how to restore habitats and then the connectivity that happens when we build like bridges and highways and different things. So wonderful job. group number 3.
I
Now we
actually
can
have one
go
more
to
thing to mention. Michelle in the group actually mentioned like just participating in events, just like beach cleanups and things like that. It's very helpful as well. Yeah.
yeah, wonderful. Yeah, beach cleanups are definitely good. Like, we had a beach cleanup and I think we picked up like over 20 pounds of garbage, and a lot of it was cigarettes, unfortunately, like a lot of it. But yeah, it's always super helpful to clean up these spaces, especially because it's going to go into the water and then it goes into neighboring parks and whatnot. So yeah, super important. Thanks so much, group number 3. Let's go to group number 4. So this one is regarding to community engagement and wildlife conservation. So a lot of the things that we've touched on have already been about community engagement and how we get people to understand the different initiatives. So does anybody from group number 4 want to share a bit about what they wrote? And if not, that's okay too. But yeah.
I can speak for group number 4.
Awesome. Thank you, Joel.
So a couple of ideas were just to develop more partnerships to incorporate more conservation. My screen is frozen.
Your voice cut out a bit there, so we didn't get the last part of what you said.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, so we could develop partnerships to incorporate conservation topics into the educational curriculum, like across various schools. So that could be public schools and as well as maybe university classes as well. We could offer tax incentives for businesses that support wildlife conservation efforts, as well as work with local governments to include conservation priorities in their urban planning and development. Um, Implement citizen science projects where residents can kind of like participate in data collection and monitoring of local wildlife. Work with local gardening clubs to promote creation of wildlife friendly habitats. Just hosting more workshops at accessible spaces that could be community centers via Zoom or even at libraries. We could create a certification program for businesses that adhere to eco-friendly initiatives, advocate for local ordinances that protect green spaces. Again, partnering with businesses to sponsor maybe potential events, and it could be like a two-way street where they sponsor our event and they also get free marketing for their business, as well as just organizing community-led conservation projects that encourage direct participation of community members.
Yeah, wonderful work, group number 4. I really like that you wrote about tax incentives for businesses that support wildlife conservation efforts. And yeah, a lot of this is wonderful. It's the advocacy. I like that you've hold workshops at accessible community centers, libraries, or via Zoom. Yeah, kind of like how we're doing today. And then citizen science projects, you'd be surprised how many of those like are really helpful for their data when they're collecting. Um, like Ocean Wives does beach cleanups, but there's a citizen science aspect of it where you're actually putting in like online what you're finding. Like, is it like how many cigarettes, how many bottles, like plastic bottles are you finding on the beach, right? And so this informs them because they're like, okay, well, what should we ban? Smoking, for example, is something that, of course, in these areas when mostly what we're finding is cigarettes is something to consider, right? And yeah, gardening clubs, that's awesome as well. Wonderful job, folks. Thank you. Group number 4. So we will go into the last group, which is Christina's and my group. So we will chat about our scenario. So group number 5. So ours was green infrastructure implementation. Christina did you want to share a bit about it, or I can do it as well?
I could do half and like you do half. Sound good?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, I can start. I had to Google a lot of it because I don't know much about this field, but I learned a lot from it, which I think is a good part of the workshop. But so some general funding options and ideas were just government investments into green infrastructure and like subsidies and grants into organizations that work on green infrastructure to incentivize like groups to do more of that. And then always like reaching out to government organizations that can lobby for more green policies, like Environment and Climate Change Canada, Infrastructure Canada, or Natural Resources Canada. And then I learned about rain gardens, tree boxes, and then green roofs, which was mentioned in the workshop. So just more of those all around, especially downtown where there's so much like foot traffic that, more protection over these green spaces would be good. And permeable pavements that help to reduce floods from rainwater, also something that I learned. And I'll pass it off to Earlier for the others.
Yeah. We also talked about pollinator gardens for bees, insects that partake in seed dispersal, which is super important to fertilize different species, especially our native species and our different plants. Planting more trees, so creating more urban forests with native species, I think is super important. And really it will help cool the city down. We do have urban heat island effect, which I will get into in a little bit. Creating multi-use trails within parks and not expanding highways and bridges into very important areas like the green belt. So, we already have wonderful trails and things. So I think finding ways to kind of build around that or kind of build with that in mind. So bioswales is another thing. So bioswales is similar to the permeable pavements in the sense that basically what a bioswale is that it's basically a basin and it's landscaped. So basically on the sidewalks, there's like a landscaped area where it's shallow and it's sort of like a drop. So what that does is it captures stormwater. And if you know what I'm talking about, probably you've seen all these before, but search up a picture and you'll know what I'm talking about. It catches the stormwater runoff and rainwater, and so that really prevents flooding, which is a huge issue and that impacts a lot of species. Better investment in oil pipelines, that's wonderful to stop transportation of dangerous chemicals across roads, highways, definitely. Education campaigns about biodiversity within schools to inform policy. And in general, more active participation from citizens towards our counselors or government leaders. I think that's super important in green infrastructure because a lot of these different advancements or expansions, I should say, are coming from, folks that are political leaders or that are in certain parties. And so I think it's really important to be able to address these things and really push out the evidence that, hey, this is not going to help us. Of course, I like to mention Indigenous nations any chance that I get because I work closely with Indigenous nations. So traditional stewardship is really important. And I would say, especially around the waterfront of Toronto, which is, as I said, very neglected, and traditional stewardship, what nations have been doing for a while. They've been contributing to, I mean, BC is a good example to a lot of research projects, how to, really respect the environment and to not, take it for granted and use up a lot of the resources. And then Tina had mentioned this as well, but corridors for animals to combat fragmentation in specific pathways and areas. So basically connecting the land back together because of, highways and different things we aren't able to, or animals aren't able to get across. So this can be done by implementing ponds, hedges, meadows, like different rock piles, and even like logs. So it's really important to be able to implement these different things and to be able to let animals pass through. And another thing about permeable pavements is that, because a lot of Toronto, I mean, they call it a concrete jungle. A lot of the, when it gets really hot, it gets really hot. And it's because basically the heat that surfaces when they heat up, when the sun is kind of on them, what would really combat this is for it to be like soil or permeable surface where that heat can be absorbed back into the earth. So I think implementing all these different ways would be able to definitely create more better green infrastructure implementations because I feel like a lot of it has just been focused on urbanization and not necessarily how to balance the priorities of wildlife as well, and being able to sorry, I just seen something in the chat. But yeah, I think all of this in general would help wildlife be able to live in the city as well. So overall, wonderful job, everybody. These were wonderful. Everybody did amazing. All of the Jamboard sheets were filled. So I want to say kudos to you guys for doing a wonderful job. So we will flip back to the presentation to say our final remarks, and then we'll let you guys go. Yeah. So thank you guys for coming. We do have a feedback survey that we will send out after via email. And if you're interested in supporting our future events, we are fundraising to be able to host in-person events where we're able to do different activities. We did have one in-person event, but we're planning to have more this summer. And to stay updated on our upcoming workshops, you can follow our social media. So we are on Instagram. Our website is www.terraelysium.ca. We're on LinkedIn, YouTube, as well as email. Our link was just pasted in to donate if you are interested in doing so. And in general, we do post a lot of our events on Instagram, on our website, and our educational resources. Specifically, our recordings will also be on YouTube, so that if you ever want to flip back to anything to see kind of what was learned, what was taught, you can do so. Next slide. No, there was no group missed in the Jamboard. It's just if you hit the right button at the top, the little arrow, it creates another sheet. So we have a very exciting announcement. So our next event has already been planned, and it is a series that I have been thinking about for a long time. And our team has finally come together, and we've set a date for it. And so this is going to be our Suffering Earth series. So this is primarily around global resource extraction, and we're going to be focusing on numerous countries across the globe. But we are starting with the environmental and humanitarian crisis in DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is going to be on June 5th at 6:30 to 9, so similar time. And the link will be pasted in to sign up if you guys are interested in doing so. But without further ado, that was the end of our session for today. Thank you all for coming, and we are so happy that we got to speak with all of you. I hope you learned a lot today. And these are our references. We'll take any final questions. Oh, thank you. Of course, of course.
I'm gonna head out, but great job. Fantastic workshop. Thank you for having us all here and for teaching us so much. Amazing job.
Thank you, Christina. So yeah, feel free to head out, guys. If you have any questions, we'll take them. Otherwise, we hope to see you at our next event.